All right, today we're back with Carl Jung's 1933 book, Modern Man in Search of a Soul. I've wanted to go through this book for a while now. This book was written during a pivotal point in Carl Jung's life following his break with the Freudian school of psychoanalysis as he develops his own school of analytical psychology. This book is a collection of essays and lectures from the late 1920s into the early 30s, and it covers topics such as dream analysis, unconscious spirituality, and the psychological challenges of modern man. Often recommended as an introduction to his works, this book is not a part of the Bollingen series properly. So this is a book that was written a bit more for the masses, and as such, I think that is a good entry point into Jung's school of thought. We'll talk a bit more on that here in a minute. So I think there are two ways to approach this book, just as a person wanting to understand themselves more fully, or as a psychotherapist who's wanting to understand Jung's perspective on that matter as such, or perhaps even better as a combination of the two. Regardless, the book covers a lot of territory regarding need for insight into the self. It even talks about dream analysis, which is interesting. It talks about the pre-logical state of the mind, i.e. the state of the mind for all of human history, except for the past few hundred years, and delineations between the physical and psychological world of experience. It talks about the spiritual problem beset upon modern man, and then it goes into the spiritual functions that a psychotherapist of today's era takes on. When discussing whether or not to start your exploration of Jung's work with this book or not, as I said previously, I think that it could be a good entry point, but I would still recommend as a first read Man and His Symbols. This is the book that Jung wrote last in his life, and it was meant to be a book that would serve well as an entry point into the rest of his work. So I would still start with this book, but then you could use this book as a second stepping stone before entering into the Bollingen series proper and getting more deep into his work. Regardless, I think it does an adequate job, even a good job of covering a lot of broad territory, covering a lot of ground, and getting you used to the way that Carl Jung thinks, the way that he writes, getting you used to his ideas in a general sense. And from there, I think you can jump in at different points into the rest of his body of work, depending on what your interests are, depending on where you really want to start. I think from there, it opens up a lot of avenues. And so you can just kind of explore on your own from that point forward. I would say that one of my favorite aspects of reading Carl Jung, which sometimes people ask me that, well, why do you like his work so much as opposed to Freud himself or some other psychoanalysts? And I would say that one of my favorite aspects of Jung is, in my opinion, he holds scientific thought in its proper place, balanced on a scale as it should be, rather than as the predominant or even the all-encompassing mode of understanding the human experience. As such, I feel that he doesn't shy away from the legitimacy of topics that are difficult to operationally define in a scientific sense. And in this way, I think he truly embodies a human position that is there to treat other humans. I think that he uses very humanistic language. I think he approaches difficult topics from a humanistic standpoint. He doesn't try to be rigid, cold, and calculating, robotic. He doesn't try to be like a machine in the way that he approaches these difficult questions that all of us struggle with, whether we admit it or not. And while he's confident to assert what he believes to know as fact, he also admits that there are certain details that escape his ability to know in and of themselves. I can offer a quote from him to elaborate this fact. He says, "I do not forget that my voice is but one voice, my experience a mere drop in the sea, my knowledge no greater than the visual field of a microscope, my mind's eye a mirror that reflects a small corner of the world, and my ideas a subjective confession." So unlike Freud in a lot of senses, he doesn't shy away from those aspects of our existence that he simply cannot know in full. So he's not dogmatic in this sense. He doesn't say that his theory is all-encompassing, and I think that this leads his work to be, in my opinion, all the more interesting as an exploration. That's what I enjoy about it. Now, in this exploration of pre-logical thought, where one is projecting much of the psyche out into the external world and that they're intertwined and not yet fully delineated between the two, I think that to understand this entire concept is really crucial to understanding where the rest of this book and a lot of Jung's work overall goes. So he lays that out earlier within an essay within this book before diving into the really crucial question that this book is aiming to tackle, that being the modern man in search of a soul. So the question is that as religious thinking is at a decline when he's writing this, and even more so today. So this book is all the more relevant today, that while it's in a decline, he's seeing neurosis as opposed to psychosis, that he's seeing this on the rise more and more as religious thinking declines. And he's saying that, and I quote, "Among all my patients in the second half of my life," that is to say, he's saying over 35 years old in his life, "there has not been one whose problem in the last resort was not that of finding a religious outlook on life." And he goes on to describe that this doesn't mean that they needed to find a religion per se or a particular church to go to, but a religious outlook on life, really getting at the crux of the problem of needing to find meaning in this existence, that these neuroses at their core, he's saying, in all instances had this at the core, this lack of meaning in life, and that people are searching for that meaning. And so as we get into the very final essay of this book, he's saying, well, is this truly a problem for the psychotherapist, for the doctor as such, or is this a problem for the clergy? But as we've already said, religious thinking is at a decline. Less and less people follow any particular religion. And he goes on to describe the type of people that are coming in with this problem, this lack of meaning and this struggle in their life. He says, "Those of whom I am thinking are by no means sickly eccentrics, but are most often exceptionally able, courageous, and upright persons who have repudiated our traditional truths for honest and decent reasons, and not from wickedness of heart. Every one of them has the feeling that our religious truths have somehow or other grown empty. Either they cannot reconcile the scientific and religious outlooks, or Christian tenets have lost their authority and their psychological justification. People no longer feel themselves to have been redeemed by the death of Christ." So these people are not going out of their way to denounce religious belief. They are not heretics, but they are truly people of the modern age who, with their upbringing and education in a scientific, materialistic viewpoint of the world, have lost their faith, essentially, and not for lack of trying. He even mentions that these people can see the happiness that those who still believe have, but they cannot even convince themselves to regain this faith. They've seen, in some sense, beyond the veil, but they still have this hole in their heart, this lack of meaning in their life. So they still have this problem for their psyche, or as the Latin suggests, for their soul. So he says, as a doctor, I can easily admit to these doubts. He's talking about the doubts of these people. While it is hard for the clergyman to do so, the patient feels my attitude to be one of understanding, while the pastor's hesitation strikes him as traditional prejudice, which estranges them from one another. So in this way, those that are in this particular situation, mind you, the people in this situation are growing in numbers rapidly over time. They find it more easy and more approachable to speak with a doctor on these matters rather than to approach the clergy and feel as though they are being judged from a traditional viewpoint. He even goes on to say that there's a quote from President Coolidge where he returns home from his absence on a Sunday morning and his wife asks, "Where have you been?" He says, "To church." And she says, "What did the minister say?" He says, "He talked about sin." Well, what did he say about sin? He was against it. So in many ways, Jung is saying that there is a mass increase in the amount of people who, by the way of human progress and the way that our culture is headed, have been pushed out of their religious tenets. They've been pushed out of a religious way of thinking, and this has been at no mere cost to them. This has been at a great cost. They are now finding themselves struggling, trying to find a sense of meaning in life, trying to refill the void in their soul, as we are, one could argue, religious creatures by nature. And they are feeling as though a more objective viewpoint of a doctor who is not tied to any particular religious dogma, but still respects the religious symbolism and the ideals of a religious viewpoint all the same, can offer them a sense of direction in their life, as opposed to feeling like they can get that same amount of value by being told the more dogmatic viewpoints that they likely already know and have been told before. So he goes on to say something that I feel is quite bold in suggesting that there is perhaps a question here that, in terms of following Christ, is a person meant to follow the imitation of Christ's life literally and specifically, or is one meant to live out their life to the fullest despite the consequences in the same way that Christ did? Is one to walk their own path but with the same veracity of Christ? And that in this position as a psychotherapist, you could help someone to find that path for themselves and help them to walk it. So this draws another clear distinction where he's saying that he does not tell people who come to them that he knows the meaning of life. And he describes that people generally get a great sense of relief from this, that as they're thinking about who they could go to answer this question, they may often come to the realization that perhaps a psychotherapist could answer this question because they deal in these matters. So they come to him saying, what is the meaning of my life? Why am I here? And he has to tell them honestly, I don't know the answer either, and that this comes as a bit of a relief to them, as they understand there's not something inherently wrong with them for not knowing the answer, but that this is in many ways the journey of life itself. So he describes to this effect that you aren't put in this position to lie or to trick even yourself into convincing yourself that you know all the answers exactly, but you are in a position to bolster your background knowledge in comparative religion, history, philosophy, and even science as a source of analogy, of metaphor, as a source of generally good advice for helping to lead or even walk beside someone on this journey so that they can find the meaning of life for their self. And that this, in many ways, is the help that they need to restore, as he's saying, this religious outlook on life. They need this source of ultimate meaning that extends beyond the very here and now of the modern way of looking at the world. And in the end, he says, the living spirit grows and even outgrows its earlier forms of expression. It freely chooses the men in whom it lives and who proclaim it. This living spirit is eternally renewed and pursues its goal in manifold and inconceivable ways throughout the history of mankind. Measured against it, the names and forms which men have given it mean little enough. They are only the changing leaves and blossoms on the stem of the eternal tree. So all in all, I feel that we're left with a really potent distillation of Jung's writings overall, organized into this relatively short and accessible book. So of course I would recommend it, particularly if you want to explore Jung's work further, or even if you don't want to take that much of a time investment and you just want to have somewhat of an understanding, albeit perhaps at a more surface level, of his work, then it's something you could read within a week or so. And I feel like for those of us who are more invested in exploring his work, it is a rich text in terms of all the ground that it covers. And as always, I feel that I'm in a fortunate position to have the opportunity to read his work and to speak on it here. So if you enjoy this discussion of his work, then like this video, and I look forward to discussing more of his work in the future. I appreciate your time as always, and I'll see you in the next one.